The night of October 17th, 1891. A blood-red harvest moon hung like a wound above the sandstone buttes of Red Mesa, Arizona Territory. In the flickering light of a solitary oil lamp, Sheriff Elijah Thorpe examined the abandoned bunkhouse where Jonas Blackwood had lived for the past 4 years. The bed was neatly made. A half-written letter sat on the small wooden table, the ink long dried on the quill. A pocket watch ticked beside it, still wound. On the floor, a single boot with strange markings carved into the leather, the other nowhere to be found. He didn't plan to leave, Thorpe would later write in his report. Something pulled him into that desert night, something he never returned from. Jonas Blackwood, a 32-year-old ranch hand known for his exceptional skill with horses and stoic demeanor, had vanished without a trace from the Caldwell Ranch, 17 miles northwest of Flagstaff. No body was ever recovered. No tracks led away from the property. The only evidence of disturbance, a set of peculiar markings found etched into the red clay soil just beyond the corral, symbols that matched those carved into Jonas's abandoned boot. According to records preserved in the Coconino County Historical Society, 3 separate search parties combed the harsh terrain for weeks. They found nothing but silence and dust. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because the desert holds secrets that can only be told to those who are patient enough to listen through to the end. The Arizona Territory in 1891 was still a lawless frontier, having achieved territorial status just under 3 decades prior. The land was vast and unforgiving, a place where men could disappear by choice, by violence, or by the sheer indifference of nature itself. The region surrounding Red Mesa existed at the convergence of cultural territories. Navajo lands to the north, Mormon settlements expanding from the east, Mexican ranching families who had worked the area for generations, and the steady influx of Anglo settlers driven by promises of mineral wealth and open range. This cultural intersection created a landscape of competing beliefs, fragmented jurisdictions, and forgotten people. Those who vanished in such places often remained simply that, vanished, their stories buried beneath layers of dust and time. Jonas Blackwood had arrived at the Caldwell Ranch in 1887. The ranch ledgers, still preserved in the Flagstaff Heritage Museum, record his hiring on April 3rd of that year. Male approx. 28 years, previous employment unknown, references none, hired on trial for horsebreaking at $15 monthly. What the ledgers don't mention is what Margaret Caldwell, the ranch owner's wife, would later describe in her private diary. The new hand speaks little, but moves with a grace that calms even the wildest stallion. His eyes hold something ancient, a knowledge of pain that demands respect. Mr. Caldwell says he's the finest horseman he's ever employed. Jonas lived alone in the smallest of the ranch's 3 bunkhouses, separate from the other workers. He took his meals alone. He rode the fence lines alone. When he spoke, which was rarely, his voice carried the faint accent of someone who had spent time in the Deep South, though he never discussed his origins. The only personal information recorded came from an 1889 tax assessment that listed him as Jonas Blackwood, colored, unmarried. His isolation was complete and seemingly self-imposed. Yet despite this solitude, Jonas had established an unexpected connection to the Caldwell's 8-year-old daughter, Emily. The child, fascinated by the quiet man's way with horses, would often watch him work from a distance. According to Emily's own account, written decades later, Jonas eventually began to acknowledge her presence with small gestures, leaving a carved wooden horse on the fence post, demonstrating how to approach a nervous colt, or simply nodding as she watched. He taught without speaking, Emily would later write. And in the weeks before he disappeared, he seemed to be teaching with greater urgency, as if he knew something was coming. The only other person who claimed any meaningful interaction with Jonas was Harold Mitchell, a Navajo tracker who occasionally worked for local ranchers. Mitchell reported that in the summer of 1891, Jonas had approached him to ask about certain rock formations beyond the northern buttes. Formations that local Navajo considered sacred ground, places where the boundary between worlds grew thin during certain celestial alignments. According to Mitchell's statement to Sheriff Thorpe, Jonas had inquired specifically about the time when the moon bleeds and the passage opens. Mitchell had warned him to stay away from such places. Jonas had thanked him and left without explanation. That autumn, as October began, ranch workers reported Jonas's behavior growing increasingly erratic. He would stand for hours at night, watching the moon. He began carving strange symbols into his belongings, symbols that William Barrett, a professor of anthropology from Flagstaff who was later consulted, identified as neither purely Navajo nor Apache, but bearing elements of both, combined with something else entirely. On the night of October 17, 1891, the night of what astronomers later confirmed was a rare blood moon eclipse, Jonas Blackwood walked into the darkness beyond the northern corral and never returned. The only witness to his departure was young Emily Caldwell, who claimed to have seen him from her bedroom window, standing at the edge of the property line as the eclipse reached totality. He raised both hands to the red moon, she would later testify, and then he walked straight toward the buttes, like someone following a call only they could hear. The desert night had swallowed him whole, leaving nothing but questions and the haunting symbols etched into the red earth. Symbols that, according to Professor Barrett's reluctant analysis, could be roughly translated as, "The door opens. The blood calls to blood. I return." Sheriff Elijah Thorpe was not a man who believed in disappearances without cause. In his 15 years enforcing law in the Arizona Territory, he had investigated dozens of missing persons, most eventually found dead from exposure, violence, or misadventure. The desert, he often said, preserved its victims in one form or another. Yet Jonas Blackwood's case defied this pattern. No body, no tracks beyond the corral, no signs of struggle or disturbance in the surrounding area. The official search was abandoned after 23 days. The report, filed on November 9, 1891, concluded simply, "Subject presumed deceased, cause unknown, case suspended pending new evidence." But privately, Thorpe remained troubled. His personal journal, donated to the Flagstaff Historical Society by his granddaughter in 1967, reveals his persistent unease. "I cannot escape the feeling that we have overlooked something essential, something beyond natural explanation. The symbols, the timing with the eclipse, the complete absence of physical evidence. These elements suggest a pattern I lack the knowledge to interpret." Thorpe's intuition would prove remarkably prescient. For while the official search had ended, a different kind of investigation was just beginning, one that would uncover a history far more complex than anyone had imagined. It began with a chance discovery. In December 1891, a Navajo shepherd tracking a lost lamb in the northern canyons came across a small leather-bound journal wedged between rocks approximately 7 miles from the Caldwell Ranch. The weather-beaten book, when turned over to authorities, was identified as belonging to Jonas Blackwood by the inscription on its first page. The contents would provide the first true glimpse into the mind of the man who had vanished. The journal, now preserved in the Arizona State Archives, begins in January 1891 and ends abruptly on October 16th, one day before Jonas's disappearance. The entries reveal a man haunted by fragmented memories and drawn to the desert's ancient history. Jonas wrote of dreams where he walked among the buttes guided by figures he couldn't quite see. He described compulsive sketching of symbols that appeared in my mind like memories of a language I once knew. Most significantly, Jonas documented a series of discoveries he had made while riding the ranch's northern boundaries. He had found rock formations with faded pictographs that matched the symbols appearing in his dreams. He described a circular depression among the northern buttes where nothing would grow and where his horses refused to step. And he noted specific dates throughout history when others had reportedly vanished from the same region, all during blood moon eclipses occurring approximately every 28 years. The most disturbing entry came from September 30th, 1891. "I now understand that I have been called back. The blood that flows in me is the same that was spilled here long ago. As the moon darkens to red on the 17th, the way will open, and I must follow. What was taken must be returned." Following this discovery, Sheriff Thorpe sought expertise from someone who might interpret these cryptic writings. He contacted Professor William Barrett, whose specialization in indigenous cultures and symbols had earned him respect throughout the territory. Barrett's initial reluctance to become involved was overcome by his scholarly curiosity when presented with transcriptions of Jonas's journal and the unusual symbols. Barrett's analysis, completed in February 1892, suggested connections between Jonas's symbols and ancient petroglyphs found throughout the region, some dating back over 1,000 years. "These are not random markings," Barrett wrote, "but a cohesive symbolic language related to astronomical events and what various tribes described as thin places, locations where the boundary between worlds could be traversed under specific conditions." Even more intriguing was Barrett's discovery when researching historical records. In 1835, exactly 56 years, or two 28-year cycles before Jonas's disappearance, a Spanish-owned ranch in the same area had reported the unexplained disappearance of a worker during a blood moon. The worker, described only as a man of mixed blood, had vanished near the northern buttes, leaving behind a single shoe marked with unusual carvings. Barrett's research revealed additional disappearances fitting the pattern: 1807, 1779, 1751, all during blood moon eclipses, all near the same geographical location, all involving individuals described as being of mixed or unknown heritage. The pattern stretched back as far as written records existed for the region. While Barrett maintained scientific caution in his official report, his private correspondence with Thorpe revealed deeper concerns. "I believe we are witnessing the continuation of something ancient, a cycle or ritual that precedes European documentation of this land. The question that troubles my sleep is whether Jonas Blackwood went willingly to fulfill this cycle, or whether he was, in some sense we cannot fully comprehend, compelled." As these investigations continued, another thread emerged from an unexpected source. Harold Mitchell, the Navajo tracker who had spoken with Jonas months before the disappearance, came forward with additional information. After consulting with tribal elders, Mitchell revealed that the region beyond the northern buttes featured in ancient stories as a place where those of divided blood might be called back to choose their true path. According to Mitchell, these stories told of individuals caught between worlds, people of mixed heritage, or those who stood at the intersection of different cultures. During specific celestial alignments, particularly blood moons, such individuals might feel drawn to certain sacred sites where they would face a choice to remain in one world or to cross permanently into another. "The elders say such crossings leave a mark," Mitchell explained to Thorpe, "a symbol etched in the earth as the door between worlds briefly opens. They say those who pass through are not truly lost. They have simply chosen to walk a different path, one that cannot be followed by ordinary means." This revelation cast Jonas's final journal entries in a new light. His writing about being called back and his reference to blood that flows in me suggested he may have understood himself to be one of these individuals caught between worlds. His mixed heritage, his solitary nature, his affinity for the desert landscapes, all aligned with the archetype described in the ancient stories. By spring of 1892, the investigation had expanded beyond a simple missing persons case to encompass historical patterns, cultural beliefs, and astronomical alignments that defied conventional explanation. What had begun as the disappearance of a quiet ranch hand had revealed itself as possibly the latest instance of a cycle stretching back centuries. Sheriff Thorpe, a man devoted to rational explanation, found himself standing at the edge of understanding, much like Jonas had stood at the edge of the ranch property on that blood-red night. In his final journal entry regarding the case, dated April 18, 1892, Thorpe wrote, "Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but witnessed. Whatever happened to Jonas Blackwood that night, I believe he walked knowingly toward it. The question that remains is whether, in 28 years, someone else will feel that same call when the moon once again turns to blood." In the spring of 1892, as Sheriff Thorpe and Professor Barrett continued their research into Jonas Blackwood's disappearance, a weathered envelope arrived at the Flagstaff post office addressed to Emily Caldwell, the ranch owner's young daughter. Inside was a small wooden horse carving, nearly identical to those Jonas had made for her before his disappearance. There was no letter, no return address, only the carving and a small piece of red cloth that matched the bandana Jonas had worn. The postmark showed it had been mailed from Albuquerque, New Mexico, over 200 miles away. When questioned, postal workers in Albuquerque could provide no description of who had sent the package. It had simply appeared in their collection, paid for with the correct postage, with no witness to its deposit. If you've been watching our videos until now, remember how Jonas was able to speak to horses with just a look? Leave a comment sharing whether you believe he truly disappeared or just started a new life elsewhere. Your thoughts help us understand what resonates most with you in these forgotten histories. The Caldwell family, initially reluctant to speak publicly about Jonas's disappearance, now broke their silence. Margaret Caldwell shared pages from her diary, documenting strange occurrences in the weeks before Jonas vanished. She described how the ranch horses had grown increasingly agitated as October approached, particularly during nighttime hours. Several had broken free of their enclosures without explanation, always running north toward the buttes before being recovered. She also revealed that 3 days before his disappearance, Jonas had approached her privately. "He asked if I would keep something safe," Margaret recounted. "He gave me a small leather pouch and said, 'If I don't return when the moon is full again, give this to the child. She'll understand when she's older.'" The pouch, which Margaret now turned over to authorities, contained a weathered piece of parchment covered in the same unusual symbols found on Jonas's boot and etched into the earth where he had disappeared. It also held a tarnished silver locket containing a miniature daguerreotype of a young black woman in 19th century dress, her expression solemn. On the back of the locket was an inscription: "Elizabeth, 1863, New Orleans." This discovery provided the first concrete link to Jonas's life before his arrival in Arizona. Professor Barrett, expanding his investigation, contacted colleagues in New Orleans and discovered records of an Elizabeth Blackwood, a free woman of color who had operated a small apothecary shop in the city until her death in 1863, the same year inscribed on the locket. Further research revealed that Elizabeth had had one son, born in 1859, father unknown. The boy, named Jonas, had disappeared from all records after his mother's death during the Civil War. Census records, apprenticeship registers, church documents, all showed no trace of the child after 1863. It was as if he had vanished completely, only to reappear 24 years later at the Caldwell Ranch in Arizona Territory. This 24-year gap remained unexplained. Who had raised Jonas after his mother's death? How had he traveled from New Orleans to Arizona? What experiences had shaped the quiet, solitary man who could calm wild horses with a look? These questions found no answers in conventional records. However, Barrett's research into the symbols on Jonas's belongings yielded an unexpected connection. The patterns matched certain ritualistic designs documented in studies of mixed African and indigenous spiritual practices that had evolved in pockets of the American South and Southwest. These syncretic traditions combined elements of West African religions brought by enslaved people with indigenous spiritual beliefs they encountered in North America. One such tradition, practiced in secret by certain communities in Louisiana and later carried westward, involved communication with ancestors and the navigation of boundaries between worlds. In this belief system, certain individuals were thought to possess the ability to traverse these boundaries during specific celestial events, particularly eclipses. The blood moon was seen as a time when the veil thinned, Barrett explained in his notes. Those with the knowledge and lineage could potentially cross over or return from previous crossings. The symbols Jonas drew appear to be instructions or maps for such crossings, passed down through generations of practitioners. This theory gained unexpected support from an ethnographic study published in 1890 by a researcher who had documented similar beliefs among mixed heritage communities along the Texas-Mexico border. The study described rituals conducted during eclipses, where participants would create symbol circles and attempt to communicate with those who had walked beyond. The researcher had dismissed these practices as superstition, but had meticulously recorded the symbols used, symbols strikingly similar to those Jonas had drawn. As Barrett and Thorpe pieced together these fragments, a more complex portrait of Jonas emerged. Not simply a quiet ranch hand, but a man potentially connected to ancient traditions spanning multiple cultures, drawn to a specific place at a specific time by forces he himself may not have fully understood until the final months of his visible life. The wooden horse carving sent to Emily Caldwell suggested another possibility that troubled Sheriff Thorpe deeply. What if Jonas hadn't disappeared in the conventional sense? What if he had simply crossed into a different kind of existence, one that occasionally allowed limited contact with the world he had left behind. The investigation took another turn when Harold Mitchell returned from consulting with a distant Navajo elder who specialized in boundary places and their histories. The elder, over 100 years old according to tribal records, recalled stories of a door in the red rocks that opened during blood moons. According to these oral histories, the door led not to death, but to the other side of the world, a place that existed parallel to our own, occasionally accessible to those who possessed the necessary knowledge and heritage. "The old one says your missing man knew where he was going," Mitchell reported. "He says such a man does not vanish. He crosses. And sometimes those who cross can still reach back, though they cannot fully return." This aligned disturbingly well with the unexpected package Emily had received. If Jonas had indeed crossed rather than died, could the carving have been his attempt to reach back, to provide some form of closure or connection to the child who had watched him with such curiosity? By summer 1892, the official investigation had stalled due to lack of conventional evidence, but Thorpe and Barrett continued their research privately. They mapped the precise location of every disappearance in their historical pattern, creating a geographical plot that centered on a specific formation among the northern buttes. They calculated the exact timing of blood moon eclipses backward and forward through history, confirming the 28-year cycle. And they began to prepare for the next occurrence, October 1919, when the moon would once again turn blood red above Red Mesa. As the investigation's focus shifted from finding Jonas to understanding what had happened to him, young Emily Caldwell became increasingly important to the narrative. The child, now 9, reported dreams in which Jonas showed her the path through the red rocks. She produced drawings of landscapes she claimed never to have seen, canyons and formations miles beyond the ranch boundaries where she had never traveled. Most disturbingly, she began to reproduce the same symbols Jonas had drawn, despite never having seen his journal. When asked how she knew these markings, she replied simply, "Jonas is teaching me. He says I'll need to know when the red moon comes again." Professor Barrett, troubled by these developments, consulted colleagues specializing in psychology and folklore. Was the child merely processing trauma through imagination? Or was something more inexplicable occurring, some form of communication that defied conventional understanding? The final significant development came in August 1892, when a surveying party mapping the Northern Territories discovered a small cave in the exact center of the geographical plot Thorpe and Barrett had created. Inside the cave, protected from weather and time, were hundreds of symbols etched into the stone, symbols that matched those in Jonas's journal and on the parchment he had left behind. Carbon dating performed years later would determine that the oldest markings dated back nearly 800 years, with new additions made periodically throughout the centuries. The most recent markings, based on their placement and weathering, appeared to have been made within the previous year. Among these fresh etchings was a distinct figure, a man standing between two worlds, 1 foot in each, his arms raised toward a circle above. Beside this figure was the same symbol Jonas had carved into his boot, the one that roughly translated as, "I return." As summer faded to autumn, Sheriff Thorpe made one final entry regarding the case in his personal journal. "I no longer search for a body, but for understanding. Jonas Blackwood has shown me that our world contains layers we glimpse only in moments of convergence. Whether he was taken or went willingly into whatever lies beyond those buttes, I believe he continues to exist in some form. The evidence suggests not an ending, but a transition, and the child's connection to him suggests that whatever boundary he crossed remains permeable under certain conditions. I will continue to watch, and I will be here when the blood moon returns." 27 years passed. The Arizona Territory became a state in 1912. The Great War transformed the nation. Technology advanced at an unprecedented pace, and in the shadow of the northern buttes, Red Mesa changed from an isolated ranching outpost to a small but established town, complete with a general store, schoolhouse, and weekly newspaper. The Caldwell Ranch, after James Caldwell's death in 1904, passed to his daughter Emily, who by 1919 had transformed it into one of the region's most successful operations. Now 36, Emily remained unmarried, dedicated solely to her land and horses. Those who knew her described a capable, serious woman who spoke little of her past, but who possessed an uncanny understanding of the desert and its rhythms. Throughout those years, Professor Barrett continued his research into the pattern of disappearances connected to the blood-moon cycle. His work had expanded to include similar phenomena reported across the American Southwest, forming a comprehensive study of what he termed threshold experiences, cases where individuals reportedly crossed from one state of existence into another under specific conditions. Sheriff Thorpe had retired in 1907, but remained in Flagstaff, his interest in the Blackwood case undiminished. Even as his health declined, he maintained detailed notes on astronomical calculations and historical parallels. By early 1919, as the next blood moon eclipse approached, both men had independently reached the same conclusion. The pattern suggested another disappearance would occur in October of that year. What neither expected was who would be called. In July 1919, Emily Caldwell began to change. Ranch hands reported finding her standing motionless at the northern property line before dawn, watching the buttes. She started carving the same symbols Jonas had made into fence posts and door frames. Her normally impeccable business ledgers now contained pages of the strange markings in the margins. When her foreman, Michael Donovan, finally confronted her about these behaviors, Emily's response was unnervingly calm. "I've been preparing for this my entire life, Michael. Jonas showed me the way years ago. When the moon turns red in October, I'll understand completely." Concerned for her mental state, Donovan contacted Barrett, who immediately traveled to Red Mesa, accompanied by the elderly but still sharp-minded Thorpe. What they found disturbed them deeply. Emily's ranch office walls were covered with the symbols, hundreds of them, arranged in patterns that Barrett recognized from the cave discoveries years earlier. More shocking was Emily's calm assertion that Jonas had been communicating with her through dreams for decades, preparing her for the crossing. "He never truly left," she told them. "He simply walks a different path now, one that I'm meant to join when the time comes." Medical examinations revealed no physical illness or injury that might explain her behavior. Psychological assessments, still primitive by modern standards, concluded only that she suffered from fixed delusions related to childhood trauma, an explanation that failed to account for her ability to reproduce symbols and describe locations she had never seen. As October approached, Barrett and Thorpe faced a troubling ethical dilemma. If their years of research had led them to the correct conclusion that something genuinely inexplicable occurred during blood moons in this specific location, should they attempt to prevent Emily from participating? Or was she, as she firmly believed, continuing a pattern that had chosen her just as it had chosen Jonas decades earlier? The situation intensified when Harold Mitchell's son, Joseph, now serving as a liaison between Navajo communities and local authorities, shared additional information passed down from his father. According to tribal histories, those who were called to the crossing place would find their way there regardless of intervention. Attempts to prevent the journey would result only in suffering, while the crossing itself was not death, but transformation. "The elders say your friend Emily has carried the mark since childhood," Joseph explained. When Jonas recognized her as one who would follow, he began her preparation. To interfere now would harm her spirit. Barrett and Thorpe, despite decades of scientific investigation, found themselves at the boundary of conventional understanding. Their concern for Emily's welfare conflicted with the growing evidence that what she experienced was real in ways their academic frameworks couldn't fully explain. During this period, Emily herself remained surprisingly functional. She continued managing her ranch operations efficiently, made clear arrangements for property transfer in her absence, and spoke lucidly on all topics except her conviction about the upcoming crossing. She appeared not as someone in the grip of delusion, but as someone preparing methodically for a journey she fully expected to undertake. 2 weeks before the forecasted eclipse, Emily invited Barrett and Thorpe to dinner at the ranch house. There, she revealed items she had kept hidden for decades, the original wooden carvings Jonas had made for her, letters she claimed had appeared mysteriously on her dresser over the years, containing knowledge only Jonas would have possessed, and most startlingly, a detailed map of the northern butte formations with a specific path marked in red, a path leading to the exact cave where the symbols had been discovered. Jonas has been guiding me my entire life, she told them. What you see as a disappearance, I understand as a transition. I'm not afraid. I'm ready. Barrett, still struggling to reconcile evidence with possibility, asked the question that had haunted their research for decades. What lies on the other side of this crossing, Emily? Her answer was both simple and profound. Another way of existing. Jonas showed me glimpses, a world that runs alongside ours but operates by different rules. A place where those of us who never fully belonged in either world can finally be whole. As the eclipse approached, Emily's certainty grew. She arranged for the transfer of her property to her foreman's family, settled all outstanding business affairs, and on October 16th, placed a sealed letter in Barrett's hands with instructions to open it after I've gone. The night of October 17th, 1919, exactly 28 years after Jonas Blackwood's disappearance, a blood moon rose above the buttes of Red Mesa. Despite Barrett and Thorpe's concerned presence at the ranch, Emily Caldwell slipped away unnoticed as the eclipse reached totality. By the time they realized she was gone, she had already reached the northern property line. Thorpe, despite his advanced age, insisted on following. With Barrett and Joseph Mitchell accompanying him, he tracked Emily's path by lantern light toward the buttes. They moved as quickly as the rough terrain allowed, but Emily maintained her distance ahead, moving with the confidence of someone following a well-known route despite the darkness. What happened next was documented in Barrett's field journal, preserved now in the University of Arizona archives. A first-hand account written by a respected academic witnessing something beyond conventional explanation. We reached the canyon entrance as the eclipse achieved totality. The moon above us had turned a deep arterial red, casting an otherworldly light across the landscape. Ahead, perhaps 50 yards distant, Emily stood before what appeared to be a vertical fissure in the rock face, a fissure that seemed to emit a faint luminescence despite the darkness surrounding it. As we called out to her, she turned briefly toward us. Even at this distance, I could see her expression, not fear or confusion, but a profound serenity. She raised one hand in what appeared to be a gesture of farewell, then turned back to the fissure. What followed defies rational explanation. The symbols we had studied for decades suddenly appeared, glowing on the rock face around the fissure, pulsing in rhythm with some unheard cadence. Emily stepped forward and, I state this with full awareness of its impossibility, the solid rock seemed to part before her. In the red moonlight, I glimpsed something beyond the opening, not darkness, but a landscape similar to our own, yet fundamentally altered, as if seen through water or heat distortion. Standing just beyond this threshold was a figure I can only describe as Jonas Blackwood, though his appearance had not aged a day since his disappearance 28 years earlier. He extended his hand. Emily took it without hesitation, and together, they stepped fully into that impossible space. The fissure closed behind them, the glowing symbols faded, and we were left staring at solid rock once more. Examination in daylight revealed no crack, no opening, no evidence that the rock face had ever been anything but solid stone. The only proof of what we witnessed, Emily's footprints in the dust, ending abruptly at the rock wall. In the days that followed, authorities conducted a standard missing persons investigation. They found Emily's affairs meticulously in order, a transfer deed for the ranch property, paid tax bills, closed accounts. Everything arranged with the precision of someone who knew exactly when they would be leaving. The letter she had given Barrett, opened the morning after her disappearance, contained only a few lines. What you've witnessed is neither death nor delusion, but the completion of a cycle begun long before any of us. Jonas showed me my true path, just as someone once showed him. I go willingly to where I belong. Do not mourn what looks like an ending. It is simply a different way of continuing. In 28 years, watch for the next one called When the Moon Turns to Blood. They will need guidance, just as I did. Sheriff Thorpe, already in fragile health, passed away 3 months after these events. Professor Barrett dedicated his remaining years to documenting every aspect of the case, though he published only the most scientifically defensible portions of his research. His private papers, sealed until 50 years after his death at his request, contain the full account, including his reluctant conclusion that some aspects of human experience remain beyond conventional categorization. The desert kept its secrets. The blood moon continued its cycle. And in the small cemetery on the outskirts of Red Mesa, two memorial stones stand side by side, though no bodies lie beneath them. One reads simply, Jonas Blackwood, 1859. The other, Emily Caldwell, 1883. The question marks, chosen deliberately by Barrett, reflect his final assessment. Not deaths, but transitions to something he glimpsed but could never fully understand. The years following Emily Caldwell's disappearance saw significant changes to Red Mesa and the surrounding territory. The ranch passed to Michael Donovan's family as Emily had arranged, eventually developing into a substantial cattle operation that employed dozens of local workers. The town grew modestly but steadily, weathering the Great Depression and benefiting from the post-war economic expansion of the 1950s. Through these decades, the story of Jonas Blackwood and Emily Caldwell faded from public memory, preserved mainly in academic footnotes and local folklore. Professor Barrett's death in 1937 removed the most dedicated chronicler of these events, though his sealed papers waited silently in university archives. Sheriff Thorpe's descendants occasionally shared his journals with interested historians, but the accounts were generally dismissed as the fantastical musings of an elderly man. Yet the pattern continued, unseen by most but meticulously tracked by a small group of individuals who had inherited Barrett's research. Every 28 years, as the cycle of the blood moon returned to its original position, they watched and waited. October 1947 came and went without incident. No disappearances were reported in the Red Mesa region during the blood moon eclipse. Those following Barrett's work wondered if the cycle had somehow been broken, if Emily's crossing had somehow completed or closed whatever process had been occurring for centuries. However, subsequent research would reveal that a young Navajo-Mexican artist named Gabriel Reyes had disappeared from his home in Albuquerque on that precise date. His abandoned studio contained paintings of red rock formations he had never visited and symbols matching those in Barrett's documentation. His final work, left on an easel, depicted a landscape beyond the buttes with two figures waiting at a threshold of light. The pattern had not ended. It had simply shifted geographically, following lines of connection that transcended physical proximity. By the 1970s, interest in the Blackwood-Caldwell disappearances experienced a revival among researchers of paranormal phenomena and alternative history. The approach of the October 1975 blood moon brought a small contingent of investigators and curiosity seekers to Red Mesa, much to the bemusement of local residents. Their presence proved fortuitous as they became witnesses to the next chapter in the unfolding mystery. Dr. Catherine Murray, a cultural anthropologist from the University of New Mexico, had spent 3 years studying Barrett's unsealed papers and tracing the pattern of disappearances across the Southwest. Her research had identified specific bloodlines and family connections linking many of the cases, suggesting that whatever called to these individuals might be inherited rather than random. Murray arrived in Red Mesa in September 1975, accompanied by her research assistant, a graduate student named David Whitefeather, whose own heritage combined Hopi and European ancestry. Their intention was to document the location during the upcoming eclipse and complete geological surveys of the northern buttes, particularly focusing on the area where Emily had reportedly disappeared. What Murray could not have anticipated was that her assistant carried the very lineage she had been tracking, that David's maternal great-grandmother had been a cousin to Jonas Blackwood's mother, creating a distant but direct blood connection to the original disappearance. As October approached, David began experiencing symptoms remarkably similar to those reported in historical cases: vivid dreams of landscapes he'd never seen, compulsive drawing of the familiar symbols, and an inexplicable pull toward the northern buttes. Murray, recognizing the pattern from her research, faced the same ethical dilemma that had confronted Barrett decades earlier: whether to interfere or to document. Choosing the latter course, she maintained detailed records as David's experiences intensified. Her field notes, later published in a controversial monograph titled Threshold States: Consciousness at the Boundaries, described how David increasingly spoke of conversations with unseen presences, particularly two figures who waited at the doorway and showed him the world beyond the rocks. In one of their final recorded conversations before the eclipse, David articulated a perspective that would significantly reshape understanding of the phenomenon. "They're not taking people away, Catherine. They're guiding them home. These crossings, they're for those of us who exist at intersections, whose blood and spirit contain multiple worlds. We feel divided in this reality because we are. What waits on the other side isn't death or another dimension as you understand it. It's integration. The ability to exist wholly without the fracturing we experience here." When asked why the crossings occurred only during blood moons at 28-year intervals, David explained that these moments represented rare alignments when the membrane between states of existence thinned enough to allow passage. The specific location in the red rocks served as a focal point where these energies concentrated most powerfully. "The symbols are a language," he added. "They're instructions for navigating the threshold, for maintaining consciousness during the transition. Without them, the crossing would destroy identity. With them, the self remains intact while transforming." On the night of October 17, 1975, Murray accompanied David to the Northern Buttes. Her audio recording of that night, now housed in the University of New Mexico's Special Collections, captures their journey to the rock face where Emily had disappeared decades earlier. As the eclipse reached totality, casting its blood-red light across the landscape, David moved with increasing certainty toward a seemingly solid wall of sandstone. The recording captures Murray's increasingly agitated questions, David's calm responses, and then, most remarkably, a series of sounds described in Murray's notes as impossible acoustics, stone moving like liquid, light becoming audible, space itself bending. Her final documented words to David were, "What do you see?" His response, clearly captured on the recording, "They're waiting. Jonas and Emily, and others. So many others. This isn't an ending, Catherine. Document everything. The next one will come in 2003. The recording continues for 17 more minutes, capturing Murray's breathing, her movement across stone, and her repeated calls of David's name. According to her written account, the rock face had appeared to ripple like the surface of disturbed water, and David had stepped through, vanishing completely. When she touched the stone moments later, it was solid and unyielding. Unlike previous witnesses, Murray approached the disappearance with modern documentation methods. She collected soil samples, measured electromagnetic readings before and after the event, and photographed the site extensively. While the physical evidence revealed no conventional explanation for what she had witnessed, her methodical approach provided the most thorough documentation of a crossing to date. The scientific community largely dismissed Murray's work as fabrication or delusion. Her academic career suffered irreparable damage from her insistence on the validity of her observations. Yet her research attracted attention from others studying similar phenomena, gradually building a network of investigators who approach these events not as supernatural occurrences, but as natural processes beyond current scientific understanding. This network would prove crucial when, as David had predicted, another individual felt the call as October 2003 approached. Advances in genetic testing by this time allowed researchers to identify potential candidates by tracing specific genetic markers through family lines connected to previous disappearances. Their preparation and documentation of the 2003 event, involving a mixed heritage physician from Tucson who had experienced increasingly vivid dreams drawing her to the Red Mesa region, would provide even more compelling evidence of the phenomenon's reality. Through each iteration, the pattern revealed itself more clearly. Not random disappearances, but a systematic process of transition for individuals whose very existence spanned different worlds. People whose heritage, consciousness, or spiritual makeup positioned them at intersections rather than centers. What looked like disappearance from one perspective represented integration from another. As Dr. Murray wrote in her final publication before her death in 1998, "What we perceive as boundaries between cultures, between states of being, between worlds, may instead be permeable membranes. Some individuals, by accident of birth or circumstance, exist precisely on these membranes, neither fully here nor there. What the blood-moon cycle offers them is not escape, but completion." The digital age brought new dimensions to the study of the Red Mesa disappearances. By the early 2000s, researchers could access historical records, astronomical data, genetic information, and witness accounts with unprecedented ease. Online communities formed around the phenomenon, sharing information and debating theories that ranged from scientific to metaphysical. One such researcher, Dr. Eliza Thorpe, great-granddaughter of the original Sheriff Thorpe who had investigated Jonas Blackwood's disappearance, had dedicated her career in theoretical physics to understanding what she termed permeable reality events. Her work at Los Alamos National Laboratory focused on quantum states where multiple possibilities might simultaneously exist, with consciousness potentially moving between them under specific conditions. As the October 2031 blood moon approached, Dr. Thorpe coordinated with a diverse team of specialists to document what would be, if the pattern held, the most thoroughly observed crossing in the cycle's history. Their preparations included advanced imaging equipment, quantum field detectors, and genetic sampling of individuals connected to previous disappearances. What they did not anticipate was how their very observation would influence the phenomenon they sought to understand. In April 2031, 6 months before the forecasted eclipse, a young journalist named Marcus Rivera contacted Dr. Thorpe after discovering family documents suggesting his great-great-grandmother had been Elizabeth Blackwood, Jonas's mother. Genetic testing confirmed a direct lineage connection, placing Marcus squarely in the bloodline that had featured prominently in the cycle of crossings. Despite this connection, Marcus initially showed none of the preliminary signs previous crossers had exhibited. He reported no unusual dreams, no compulsive drawing of symbols, no inexplicable attraction to the Red Mesa region. Dr. Thorpe hypothesized that perhaps the pattern was indeed breaking down, or that genetic connection alone was insufficient to trigger the calling. Yet as her team's research intensified, as they conducted interviews with Marcus about his family history, showed him the symbols from Barrett's original documentation, and brought him to the site of previous disappearances, something unexpected occurred. The very act of investigation appeared to activate the dormant pattern. By August, Marcus began experiencing the familiar symptoms. His dreams filled with landscapes beyond the buttes. His journals, initially analytical reports of the research project, gradually incorporated the symbols previous crossers had drawn. And most significantly, he began to speak of conversations with those who had crossed before, particularly Jonas, Emily, and David. "They're waiting," he told Dr. Thorpe during a recorded interview in September. "But they're concerned about something different this time. They say too much observation might destabilize the crossing point, that your instruments could disrupt the alignment." This warning created an ethical and scientific dilemma for the research team. Their goal had been to document and understand the phenomenon, but if their very presence might interfere with it, might potentially harm Marcus if he was indeed being called to cross, how should they proceed? The decision they reached was a compromise. Scaled-back instrumentation at a greater distance from the site, with only Dr. Thorpe accompanying Marcus to the actual location during the eclipse. This approach, they hoped, would allow documentation while minimizing potential interference. As October 17, 2031 approached, a new element entered the unfolding story. Marcus, now fully immersed in the experience of being called, began to articulate aspects of the crossing that previous accounts had only hinted at. "It's not just a doorway, it's a rejoining," he explained. "Those of us who are called exist simultaneously in both realities already, but in fragmented form. What you perceive as disappearance is actually unification, the pieces of self, divided across realities, becoming whole again." When asked why only certain people with specific genetic connections experienced this calling, Marcus offered an explanation that bridged mystical tradition with quantum theory. Consciousness isn't contained solely within the brain or body. It exists in a field state that interacts with multiple potential realities simultaneously. Most humans are anchored firmly in a single dominant reality. But some of us, particularly those whose bloodlines cross significant cultural or spiritual boundaries, exist in a state of quantum superposition across realities. The blood moon cycle creates a harmonic resonance that allows these divided consciousness states to recognize and reintegrate themselves. This perspective aligned surprisingly well with Dr. Thorpe's own theoretical work on consciousness as a quantum field phenomenon rather than a purely neurological process. The possibility that certain individuals might exist in a state of divided consciousness across multiple potential realities, and that specific astronomical alignments might facilitate reintegration, offered a framework that was simultaneously scientific and transcendent. On the night of October 17, 2031, as the blood moon rose above Red Mesa, Dr. Thorpe and Marcus Rivera approached the northern buttes. Remote sensors positioned discreetly around the area recorded environmental data, while a single camera with advanced low-light capabilities documented their journey from a distance deemed safe by Marcus's guidance. What happened next was captured in Dr. Thorpe's audio recording and the distant camera's footage, the most complete documentation of a crossing ever obtained, though still subject to multiple interpretations. As the eclipse reached totality, the familiar symbols began to appear on the rock face, not carved or painted, but luminescent, as if light were emerging from within the stone itself. Marcus approached without hesitation, his movements becoming increasingly fluid and purposeful. At the threshold, he paused and turned back toward Dr. Thorpe. "They're all here," he said, his voice calm but filled with wonder. "Not just Jonas and Emily, but all of them, throughout time. This isn't an ending. It's a continuation." The camera footage shows what happened next, the apparent rippling of solid stone, a momentary illumination from within the rock face, and Marcus stepping forward into what should have been solid matter, but instead appeared to receive him like water. In the final frame before he disappears completely, multiple figures seem visible within the light, though image analysis would later debate whether these were actual presences or artifacts of the unusual lighting conditions. Most remarkable was what occurred after the crossing. As the eclipse began to wane, the symbols on the rock face pulsed one final time, and then, instead of simply fading as in previous accounts, they rearranged themselves into a clear message in English. The circle continues. 2059. The next crossing will be the last. Both worlds are realigning. This message, captured clearly in the camera footage and witnessed directly by Dr. Thorpe, suggested a finite nature to the cycle that had not been indicated in any previous crossing. It implied some larger process at work, one that the individual crossings were part of rather than the phenomenon itself. In the years following Marcus Rivera's crossing, Dr. Thorpe's research team analyzed every aspect of the documented event. Their findings, published in a series of papers that challenged conventional scientific boundaries, suggested that what had been occurring at Red Mesa for centuries might be part of a larger cosmic realignment, a gradual harmonization of divergent realities that had split at some point in the distant past. The projected final crossing in 2059 became the focus of intense speculation and preparation. If the message was accurate, it suggested not just another individual crossing but a more significant event, perhaps a final closing of the gap between worlds that had allowed these transitions to occur. As Dr. Thorpe wrote in her final assessment, what began with Jonas Blackwood's disappearance in 1891 may not have been the beginning, but merely the first documented instance of a process that has occurred throughout human history. Individuals whose very existence spans multiple realities have served as bridges and pioneers, mapping the path between worlds that all of reality may eventually follow. The disappearances that seemed so mysterious may in fact be glimpses of our larger cosmic destiny, the reunification of all possible states of being. The Red Mesa phenomenon had evolved from a missing person case to a philosophical and scientific inquiry into the fundamental nature of reality itself. What had once been dismissed as superstition or delusion now offered potential insights into consciousness, quantum states, and the permeable boundaries of existence. And somewhere beyond the buttes, in a reality that ran alongside our own yet operated by different rules, those who had crossed before waited for the final alignment. Not gone, but transformed, existing in a state of wholeness that those left behind could only glimpse during blood moons when the veil between worlds grew thin. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality. And if you haven't already subscribed, do it now to join us on our journey through history's most enigmatic disappearances. As the blood moon continues its eternal cycle, the question remains not whether such crossings are possible, but whether we ourselves exist in multiple states simultaneously, fragments waiting to be made whole when the light turns red and the doorway between worlds opens once more.